Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're digging into a real giant from the past, Huabeisaurus allocotus.
That's right, a sauropod dinosaur from northern China, late Cretaceous period.
And we're working from a couple of key sources here, the Wikipedia page for a good overview, and a detailed research paper. It's called Osteology of Huabeisaurus allocotus. You know the one.
Yep, the definitive study. Our goal today is really to unpack what this North China lizard, as its name means, tells us about sauropod evolution, particularly in Asia.
Exactly. And just quickly, for anyone new to this, sauropods, these are the huge four-legged herbivores, right? Long necks, long tails. Think Brontosaurus or Diplodocus, that kind of body plan.
Precisely, the absolute titans of the dinosaur world. And Huabeisaurus lived quite late in the game, the late Cretaceous. We're talking somewhere around maybe 99 down to 70 million years ago.
What makes Huabeisaurus stand out, though, is the fossil itself, isn't it? The completeness.
It really is. Finding such a relatively complete sauropod is, well, pretty rare, and it makes Huabeisaurus incredibly important for understanding this group.
Okay, so let's start with the discovery. Where and when did this giant first see the light of day again?
It all started back in the 1990s. The location was Shaanxi province in northern China, specifically places called Kangdaliang and Huyu.
Right?
And the main specimen, the one they based the species description on the holotype that came from the upper part of the Huiquanpu Formation. That's the rock layer.
Huiquanpu Formation, got it. And the name Huabeisaurus allocotus. You mentioned North China lizard.
Yeah, Huabeisaurus literally means North China lizard.
Oh.
Pretty straightforward. It was named back in 2000 by Pang King and Cheng Zhengwu. The allocotus part is the specific species name.
And nailing down the age of those rocks, how'd they do that?
They used a few different methods, which is always good. They looked at tiny fossils like ostracods, little crustaceans, and charophytes, which are a type of algae.
Okay.
Plus, they used fish and track dating on minerals from the rock. All those point towards the late Cretaceous for that upper part of the formation, probably Cenomanian to Campanian stages.
Right, several lines of evidence converging. So let's picture this dinosaur. How big are we talking?
We're talking seriously big. The estimates put it at around 20 meters long, that's about 66 feet,
Wow.
and maybe 5 meters or 16 feet high at the hips. A classic sauropod build, quadrupedal, plant eater, long neck, long tail.
And the specific skeleton they found, was it a young one, an adult?
It seems like it was almost fully grown, an almost mature individual.
How can they tell?
They looked at bone fusion. On most of the vertebrae, the different parts were already fused together with no visible sutures or seams, which you usually see in younger animals.
Oh, okay.
But interestingly, some parts of the pelvis still had those sutures visible. So it suggests it was very close to adult size, but maybe not quite 100% there yet.
That's fascinating detail. So what bones did they actually find? Was it a complete skeleton or more fragmented?
It was pretty substantial, definitely not just a few fragments. They found teeth, bits of the limbs, and quite a few vertebrae from the neck, back, hips, and tail. The holotype itself is what we call partially articulated.
Meaning some bones were still connected.
Exactly. Still in their life positions, more or less. So teeth, vertebrae, ribs, the shoulder girdle, the pelvic girdle. Pretty much all the main parts were there, including almost complete limbs.
That's incredible. Finding articulated remains must be a huge advantage.
Oh, absolutely. It gives you so much more confidence about which bone belongs where and that it's all from one animal.
Did they record how the bones were lying in the ground? Does that tell us anything?
Yes, they did. The details from the quarry map suggest the animal probably died and came to rest on its left side. And even though some bones had separated a bit, disarticulated the fact that most major bones weren't duplicated, and things like the sacrum and the start of the tail were still connected, strongly points to it being a single individual.
Right.
Even some of those small V-shaped bones under the tail, the chevrons, were found associated with the correct vertebrae. And the limb bones were roughly where you'd expect them to be relative to the body.
Makes sense. You mentioned teeth were found too. What were they like?
Yeah, 2 teeth. One found during the dig, another popped out later when they were preparing the fossils in the lab.
Okay.
They're considered part of the holotype because they were found right there with the skeleton. They had sort of cylindrical crowns, a bit wrinkled on the surface.
Any unique features?
Well, their shape, their slenderness was sort of intermediate. Not as broad as some sauropods like Euholopus, but not as pencil thin as others like Fuiangosaurus.
Interesting.
And importantly, they weren't strongly twisted like the teeth you see in, say, brachiosaurids.
Okay. Moving down the body. The The neck. Sauropod necks are always impressive. What vertebrae did they find?
They recovered 4 neck vertebrae, cervical vertebrae. 2 were pretty broken up, but 2 were almost complete.
Right.
The fragments seemed to be from further forward in the neck. They also found bits of the cervical ribs, those small bones attached to the neck vertebrae.
And what was special about those ribs?
They were fused to the vertebrae, which isn't always the case, and they pointed downwards, what we call pendant. That's a feature seen in some other sauropods from that part of the world during the Cretaceous.
Got it. And the back and the hips. Dorsal and sacral vertebrae?
From the back, the dorsals, they only had a part of one centrum, the main body of the vertebra, and 3 more complete ones from near the tail end. But these had been heavily restored with plaster.
Okay, common practice, but makes some details harder to see.
Right. But they could see there were no neurocentral sutures, those fusion lines, confirming the maturity aspect we talked about.
And the sacrum, the hip vertebrae.
That was interesting. Initially, they thought it was 5 fused vertebrae. But looking back at photos taken before restoration, they realized it was actually 6. It seems the last back vertebra had shifted after death and kind of crushed the first sacral rib, which confused the count initially.
Huh, a bit of fossil detective work there. What about the tail, the caudal vertebrae?
They found a good series of tail vertebrae, and along with them, 12 chevrons.
Those Y-shaped bones underneath.
Exactly. They protect blood vessels and provide muscle attachments. There might have been more originally, but 12 is a decent number.
Let's shift to the limbs now. The shoulder blades, scapulae.
Both left and right were found, though damaged near the shoulder joint area. But piecing them together gives a good idea of the shape. Broad plate at the top with the acromion process.
A bony projection.
Right. And the blade itself was, long, making up most of the bone's length. One detail they noted was the ratio of the blade's height, max to minimum, was about 1.7.
Does that ratio mean anything specific?
It helps compare it to other sauropods. The overall shape, the acromon, the way the blade widens, it fits generally within a big group called Symphospondyle, more advanced sauropods.
Okay. And the other limb bones, forearm, legs.
They found the left radius one of the forearm bones. It was damaged at the ends, but described as quite slender, gracile. But the really notable thing was its distal end, the wrist end. It was really wide, transversely expanded.
And that's significant.
Very, because you see a similar feature in some advanced titanosaurs, like Alamosaurus and Dinosaurs. It might be related to weight support, maybe convergent evolution, maybe something else. It definitely makes you think about its relationships.
Interesting connection. What about the hind limbs and pelvis?
The femoral thigh bones and the pelvic bones, the pubes and ilia, were found near the sacrum, where you'd expect. And the lower leg bones, the crura, from both sides, were found close together too.
So a pretty coherent skeleton overall. Now, I remember reading about another bone, a humerus, an upper arm bone, found separately, the paratype.
Yes. That's a bit of a side story. This lone humerus was found quite far from the main skeleton, over 200 meters away.
Wow, that is far.
And not just far, but also about 90 meters lower down in the rock layer. So different location, different stratigraphic level, likely a different older time.
Okay, that seems crucial.
Absolutely. And since it's a humerus and the holotype didn't preserve the humerus well, there's no anatomical overlap to compare them directly.
So you can't definitively say it belongs to Huabeisaurus.
Exactly. Given the distance, the different rock layer, and no overlapping bones, it's best considered not part of the holotype individual, and maybe not even Huabeisaurus at all.
Makes sense. What else was found near that isolated humerus?
That layer also had hadrosaur bones, duck-billed dinosaurs, maybe something like Shentungosaurus and some indeterminate ankylosaur bits, armored dinosaurs.
So a different neighborhood, potentially. Okay, let's get back to the main find. Classification. Where does Huabeisaurus fit in the big sauropod family tree? This seems like it might be complicated.
It is, a bit. When it was first named, the authors actually proposed a whole new family for it, Huabesauridae, maybe including another sauropod called Tangviosaurus.
But that didn't stick.
Not really, no. It hasn't been widely adopted by other researchers. More recently, it's often been placed in a family called Euhilopodidae.
Okay.
But even that's debated. Euhilopodidae is kind of a broad grouping within Symphospondyle, and some think it probably needs breaking up because it contains quite a mix of sauropods.
Right, so the picture is still developing. Were there other ideas floated about its relationships?
Oh, yes. Pang and Chang initially wondered if it might be related to something called Titanosaurus phalloidi, but that's based only on a femur, and the Huabesaurus femur looks different, so that's unlikely.
Any other proposed relatives?
People have suggested links to Nemegtosauridae, or placing it as a Titanosauriform, but outside the main group of advanced titanosaurs called Lithostrossia.
Mm.
Others have pointed out similarities to Borealosaurus and Opisthochelocottia, or maybe Fusuisaurus and Sonatosaurus. There's even a connection proposed to an unnamed sauropod from Japan, the Toba sauropod.
So lots of possibilities being explored. It really highlights how important this relatively complete fossil is, doesn't it?
Absolutely critical. Huabeisaurus gives us a much better anchor point for understanding all those other more fragmentary sauropods from the Cretaceous of East Asia. It helps piece together the bigger picture of Titanosauriform evolution.
Is there a broader pattern emerging in Asia?
There seems to be. Generally, the Jurassic sauropods found in Asia are more primitive types, outside the big Neosauropoda group. But by the Cretaceous, the Asian sauropods we find, like Huabeisaurus, are pretty much all Titanosauriforms.
Suggesting maybe some regional evolution endemism?
Exactly. It hints that East Asia might have been a bit of an isolated evolutionary cradle for these giants during the Cretaceous.
Okay, so to pin down Huabeisaurus itself, researchers look for unique features, right? Autapomorphies.
Precisely. Dimmick and colleagues, in a 2013 paper, listed 12 specific characteristics that seem unique to Huabeisaurus.
Can you give us a few examples? What kind of details are we talking
A
about?
lot of it is quite technical, relating to the vertebrae. Things like specific ways that the laminate, those bony ridges or struts on the vertebrae, are divided.
Okay.
For instance, a divided presigodiapophyseal lamina on the rear neck vertebrae, or a divided anterior spinodiapophyseal lamina on the front back vertebrae. Also, details in the tail vertebrae, like the relative size of certain fossa or depressions on the neural arch.
So very fine anatomical details.
Yes, and things like the small tail ribs disappearing quite early, around the 8th tail vertebra, or the way the bottom third of the midtail vertebrae expands backwards.
Any others that are maybe easier to visualize?
Well, there are those two ridges on the sides of the midtail vertebrae. There's a little bump on the coracoid bone in the shoulder, and as we mentioned, that very wide distal end of the radius.
Right, the forearm bone.
Yeah, about twice as wide as the midshaft. Also a little projection, a tubercle sticking out from the back of the ischium and the pelvis. And finally, a relatively high tibia to femur ratio. So its lower leg bone was quite long compared to its thigh bone.
It's amazing how these subtle features combine to create a unique fingerprint for the species. Okay, let's place it back in its world. What was the environment like? Its paleoecology.
Well, we know it lived in what's now Shaanxi province during the late Cretaceous. The holotype was found in silty mudstone, which tells us it was deposited by a river system, and it wasn't alone there. Other dinosaurs found in the same formation include the Ankylosaur tanzanosaurus, some uncertain theropod material, bits of hadrosaurs, and another ankylosaur called Shanxia, though that might just be indeterminate ankylosaur material.
So a diverse fauna.
Definitely. Plus the smaller stuff like ostracods and charophytes we mentioned earlier, confirming an aquatic component to the environment.
It paints quite a picture. So, wrapping up our deep dive on Huabeisaurus, what are the main things we should take away?
I'd say the key points are, it's a large late Cretaceous sauropod from northern China, crucially important because its skeleton is relatively complete.
Right.
This completeness gives us vital clues about sauropod anatomy and evolution in Asia during that time. We know its basic look, 20 meters long, typical sauropod build.
Yeah.
And its classification is still being actively researched, but its unique features clearly set it apart.
And for me, that weirdly wide radius bone still sticks out. It's such a specific detail that hints at potentially complex evolutionary relationships or convergences.
It really does. Little details can hold big clues. Which leads us perfectly into a final thought for you, our listeners.
Okay.
Given all these different ideas about where Huabeisaurus fits, maybe an early Titanosauriform, maybe closer to Opisthochelocottia, maybe something else entirely, what kind of future discoveries do you think could finally settle its place in the family tree?
More complete fossils from that region, maybe? Or finding related species elsewhere?
Perhaps. And thinking bigger, what could locking down Huabeisaurus's position tell us about how these giant herbivores spread across Asia and how they evolved right up until the end of the dinosaur era? Something to ponder.